Listeners, are you in the messy middle of your memoir? You know that place where the material's churning inside you and you're wondering what in the world you're trying to say? If you're raising your hand, I've got a treat for you. During this week's episode, I'll do a deep dive into how you can structure your book in a very accessible way alongside Wendy Dale, author of the Memoir Engineering System. This conversation will change the way you think about structure, scenes, and what actually makes a memoir work, and why your job as a memoirist isn't to show, but to transport your readers. Let's get to that conversation right now. Welcome to Writing Resilience, the podcast for writers who want to write and live the story that sets them free. I'm your host, Lisa Cooper Ellison, a writer, transformational and trauma-informed coach, story alchemist, and fellow traveler on the winding road of healing and creativity. Each week, I'll share tools, practices, and conversations that will help you let go of what no longer serves you as you create stories that change lives, especially your own. Together, we'll explore how to trust your creative voice, support your mental health and resilience, work with your nervous system and unique design, and stay connected to your deepest calling as a writer, even when life gets messy. It's time, my friends, to write and live the story that sets you free. I'm honored to walk that journey alongside you, one story and one episode at a time. Listeners, have you finished a first draft of your memoir but aren't sure what comes next? What if the secret to making your story resonate with readers isn't more pages, but instead a clearer question at the heart of your book? On February 25th, I'm teaching a live online class with Jane Friedman called Identify Your Memoir's Essential Question. In 90 minutes, you'll learn how the right essential question can shape your story, give your book purpose, and help you decide what truly belongs on the page and what doesn't. Whether you're stuck in the messy middle or polishing for submission, this class gives you a repeatable process to revise more confidently and start seeing your memoir through a fresh lens. Join me, Lisa Cooper Ellison, on February 25th at 1 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time to unlock your memoir's central question. Register today by going to janefriedman.com. Well, hello, Wendy. Welcome to the Writing Your Resilience podcast. I'm so excited to have you on today.
I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Well, I know that my listeners are going to be in for a real treat because we are going to dive deeply into your book, The Memoir Engineering System, which I'm holding up for anyone who is seeing this on YouTube. And we're going to dive into a lot of the concepts that you talk about in this book. However, I always start out in the same way by giving my guests a chance to let us know what you would like us to know about your book and about you.
If I had to tell you, I guess, two things about my book, they would be that it took me 2 months to write it and 15 years to research it. So I guess it took me 15 years to complete. I'm not sure how you want to look at that. About me, I've been a memoir writing coach for 18 years. My own memoir was published by Crown, part of Penguin Random House, and I love doing this.
Okay, so you said something that I have to follow up on, and that is you wrote it in 2 months and it took you 15 years to research. Please tell us a little more.
Well, so I wrote the book that I always wanted as a memoirist. Years ago, when I started working on my own memoir, what happened was that I didn't really know what I was doing. I was a professional writer. I'd been a screenwriter, I'd been an ad copywriter, I'd been a journalist, and I thought, well, how hard can it be to write about your life, right? And you're nodding, right?
Oh,
Because
yes.
it seems like the easiest thing in the world. I thought, well, you don't need plot because I have the plot. It's my life. Well, that was really misguided. So I eventually got an agent, and she said, well, she wouldn't be my agent until I promised to completely rewrite my book and learn about structure. So this really was my introduction to the word structure, which I hadn't even heard before. This was, we're talking a little over 20 years ago. So I wrote this book by a process of trial and error, really, because I didn't understand structure and I didn't find the information anywhere. I didn't understand what makes for a good memoir. I think that it can actually be easier to write fiction because you do it intuitively and you get to make stuff up. But the challenge with memoir is you have to have it feel like a novel, but you can't make stuff up. And so it's this
Right.
whittling away process, which is incredibly difficult. So I had this problem of not understanding structure. And a few years later, I started teaching memoir, and that's when this came back at me. And I thought, well, I have all of these people with the exact same problem I have. And I solved it really by trial and error, by writing draft after draft. And that's not a great way to approach this when you're a teacher. So, little by little, I started this process of understanding how written story works. And it really did take me 15 years. Little by little, I pieced it together. I started understanding what makes a written story work. And it's true for novel as well as memoir, but it's so much more important in memoir because a lot of novel writing you do intuitively.
Yeah, and I think an area that I see a lot of memoirists get stuck in is the what I call the and then this happened and then this happened and then this happened dilemma where it's like, okay, yes, that is how life works. And life is a little chaotic, right? We're not curating life, but we are curating a story. And so, how do you put all of this together? And we're going to talk about some of the decision points that writers are going to come to or things they need to think about as they're putting their story together in a moment. But I want to start this conversation by talking about structure, since you mentioned it. And it is this enigma. Everybody wants to know how to do it. Everyone wants to feel like there's a structured way to write their book. And yet, people often struggle to understand what structure is. So, when you think about the word structure, how do you define it?
A lot of people, when they're talking about structure, what they're actually referring to is what I call global structure. So we're talking three acts, you're talking the hero's journey, you're talking big picture structure, which is great. That's how I suggest people start out with this global idea where your book starts in time, where it ends in time, taking this bird's eye view. I definitely suggest that. But where I find people struggle is actually what exactly you said. This happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. So that is chapter structure. And that is where I feel people get off track. How do you actually tell a story in your chapter without it being a bunch of random things you lived through? In a travel memoir, it's really easy to see this because someone will move to Paris and it's like, well, this is what I did my first day in Paris, and this is what I did my second day, and this is
Yes.
what I did my third day. And that's a diary. That's not a memoir. And nobody really cares. I mean, you know what I'm saying, right? It's
Yeah.
a
Oh, I
harsh
do.
yeah, it's a harsh truth that I say to people. No one cares about your life. What do they care about? They care about a good story, right? The same way you care about a novel. We care about a good story. So the challenge really is in taking these true stories from your life and finding structure in them. And for me, the biggest challenge is solving the this happened, then this happened problem.
Yeah, and I'm a very visual person, so I'm going to add my visual layer to this. A metaphor that I often use when I'm thinking about structure is a house, right? So a house can be a mansion, it can be a bungalow, it can be all of these different things, but within the house, there are different rooms that serve different functions. And, we don't do the same thing in the bathroom that we do in the kitchen unless you are on Seinfeld. And then, that can happen, right? So each one has to have a function, and we need to understand what that is and how they all work together to create a house. And another way to think about it is if you think about your story lives in a neighborhood, right? So all of the streets or all of the houses on that street, they're linked together by this road, which is very similar to the metaphor that Dinty Moore uses when he talks about the magnetic river of your story and how it all needs to flow together. So finding that structure is really important. So we're going to talk about what are the things you need to do in order to create that structure at the chapter level so that there's flow within this chapter and that flow within the chapter leads to flow within your book. But before we get there, you also said something else that I know, listeners are going to be like, boo, 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 boo. Wait a second, wait a second. I need to know the answer to this. And that is what makes a good memoir?
What makes a good memoir? I think a good memoir reads much like a novel. I really do. So I tell people that using your house metaphor, which I love. I'm going to use a similar, I'm going to use a house metaphor, but I'm going to change it just a little bit in response to your question. What makes a good memoir? I tell my clients that structure is like the structural engineering in a house. No one notices it. You don't walk into a
Yeah.
beautiful home and say, wow, who's your structural engineer? Right? You notice the beautiful furniture, the color of the wall, the paintings. That is your prose. So, what makes a good memoir? People notice the prose. But if you don't have structure, you don't have four walls. And so no one's going to walk into that house in the first place. So to me, having structure that works and having emotionally affecting prose, that combination creates a great memoir.
Yes, you have to have both. And I took a class at Kenyon Review Online this summer because I like to do some continuing education all the time. And I was studying with Mitchell Jackson. And so he wrote the memoir Survival Math. And one of the things he was talking about was how important it is to really pay attention to language and sentence structure, that is something that will give a writer a leg up. Right. So if they have that, but I agree, if you don't have the other piece, that structural engineering, that schematic in the background that makes it all come together, your story is going to fall apart and people are going to get lost in what you're trying to say. And so in your book, you talk about something early on, and I want to get to this because it's something I'm constantly trying to get people to do. And I always love it when someone else is saying the same thing. So, if you have clients and they're not listening to you, they can listen to my voice, right? We can
I
help each other out
appreciate
in that
it,
way.
Lisa. Yes. Good.
And that is the benefit of reading books in progress, right? Reading manuscripts that are not yet published. Because I see so many writers, and I, of course, have done this myself, that you try to reverse engineer what a published author has done to see how it works. And sometimes it's easy to do that, and sometimes it's not. But when something is not working and you see it on the page, when someone is in the middle of a draft, that messy middle, you can learn so much by reading those books. And I have read many a book as well. Why do you feel like that's so essential?
Oh, this is really talking about how the memoir engineering system came to be. Because I talk about in the early chapters when this agent said to me, I'll take you on, but you have to completely rewrite your book because you know nothing about structure. I ran to Barnes and Noble and didn't find much about structure. So my next step was to go to published memoirs. And what are they doing? How do you construct a story? Because obviously I didn't know what I was doing. My manuscript isn't working. And I couldn't find the seams. When things are working, you don't notice it. Just like you don't notice the structural engineering of a house. You notice when the wall is lopsided, right?
Right.
So this is how I learned structure was actually working with students and getting imperfect manuscripts and saying, there's a problem here. What is that problem? And number two, how would I fix it? And reverse
Yes.
engineering this over the course of 15 years until I had a set of principles of what you actually need to do instead of what you shouldn't do. So it took me 15 years to do this little tiny things. Well, don't commit this error. So reverse engineer, actually do this. So, oh, you are speaking to the choir, Lisa.
Yeah. And so here's what I want all the listeners to hear. This is why it's so important to be a beta reader, right? Read books on craft so that you understand these fundamental principles, so you understand how things work, and then serve as beta readers. Because when you are reading these works in progress, you will have an opportunity to mentally apply these skills to work that is not your own, where you don't have the skin in the game, where you can say, okay, how could I potentially serve this author by sharing this insight or this information? And then, of course, if someone gives you that feedback, or if you're giving this to the author, they don't have to do it, right? But you can begin to understand how all this works in a different way. And I say that because there are some people who they just want to have an editor to walk that process with them. And there's nothing wrong with that, and I do have people that I work with and I've worked with for a long time. But even the people I work with for a long time, I'm like, okay, you need to read other people's manuscripts that are in progress so that you can see how these flaws work. Because when they're just reading, these best memoirs, like the, New York Times bestsellers, they're not getting that view, right? And it's humbling when you see it and then you go, oh, and I've made that same error.
Yeah. I tell my clients, you'll never know what it's like to read your book for the first time, right? And so, look, this other person, they're doing the exact same thing as you. I want you to read this version that you
Yes.
didn't write, that you can be objective about, and just feel how it's affecting you. Feel what's bothering you, and understand that you're doing the exact same thing, and let's fix that.
Yes. So it can be a huge learning tool to be able to do that when you have also studied some of these principles. So you can go, aha, that's what it is, rather than just go, I don't like it. Because just liking something, that's important, right? Especially if you're a reader, there are going to be things you like and you don't. But if you are going to be a writer, understanding that why, okay, I don't like it, why, that's the piece that will really serve you. And so when we think about structure, and you think specifically about structure at the chapter level, what are the ingredients or elements that you think are most important for writers to think about so that they can follow your memoir engineering system? So they're working through your schematic.
Okay. Might be a little bit of a long answer, so interrupt me at any point, Lisa. What it took me 15 years to understand is that I can define now structure in two words, and it really is connected events. Now, it took me 15 years to get to that simplicity, right? And there's a lot in those two words. There's a whole book on, what these two words mean and how to use them in the right way. So, connected events, the real issue that we were talking about is the this happened, then this problem. I sometimes call this the why is the author telling me this problem? Because from a reader's point of view, it's like, okay, you're just telling me a bunch of stuff you did, but why? So what's the point? Is what
Right.
happens with the this happened, then this happened problem. So the way to solve this is to let a reader know what this has to do with this, why what's happening here, what it has to do with what happened here. And I'm holding up my fingers here, and what I'm trying to represent is you have one scene here and you have another scene here. So something will happen in one scene and something is going to happen in the next scene. Now, in between those scenes, if it's not clear to your reader what these two scenes have in common, you have a chunk of transition writing. So that is your connecting material. So you have these two components in your book. You have scenes and transitions, and using them in the right way gets you to connected events. So again, that transition lets your reader know why what happened in this scene, how it is related to what's going to happen in your next scene. And your reader doesn't say, wait, why is the author telling me this? Because you let them know what they're about to read, what it has to do with what they just read.
Yeah, I love that. I often call it the cause and effect chain, right? And then we have to maintain the cause and effect chain. And when it gets broken, that's often where confusion exists. So when we're thinking about scenes, because you talk in your book about how show don't tell gets people in a lot of trouble, especially in memoir, right? And so I want to talk about that with you. So, what is it that a scene is supposed to do? So, what's a scene supposed to do if it's not a moment of showing? Or is it a moment of showing? Help us understand what we need to do there, because you say something really important about it in your book.
So I think there are a lot of books on craft that tell people that your book needs to be a visual experience. Yes, it does, but it's so easy to do. If I say the striped cat, don't you have an image? Didn't that come to your brain? Striped cat. So people take this overboard and they try and describe absolutely everything. It's the striped cat on the red velvet sofa in the ornately decorated room with the and I just don't need it, right? And so people get a little hung up on the show. It has to be a visual experience. Well, absolutely, we need a few visuals, but just saying a striped cat is pretty much enough. What do you do with the rest of your prose in that paragraph?
Yes.
I tell people to fill it with subjective writing. And subjective writing is basically putting us inside your head. So this striped cat walks up to you. Now interpret this moment for me. What are you feeling when this striped cat comes up to you? So your goal as a writer in your scene is to transport your reader, to make them forget they're reading a book, to make them become you, to make them feel like they're living through this with you. And the way to do this really is through subjective writing. So that's what transports you. That's what your reader wants. So I think there are a lot of books out there that say, oh, your reader wants this visual experience. Yeah, but they want to be transported. And having an image in your head isn't quite the same thing as feeling like you've become the narrator. And the way to feel like you've become the narrator is to think the narrator's thoughts. And it's incredible what that does for your book. So you need to transport. I just want to, before I want to say one more
Yeah,
quick thing before
absolutely.
I get all excited about this.
I love geeking out with people on this. So you're
Oh, I
speaking my
love it.
language.
We need to talk more often, Lisa. I don't have a lot of people who love to geek out on this stuff. So you will have this subjective writing in your scene that transports your reader. And what's really important is that something always needs to happen in your scene.
Yes.
I'm sure you've seen so many of the people you work with. It's so easy to fall in this trap as a memoirist. It's so easy to describe the day that you lived through, right? And you really need to understand that novel writing and good memoir writing, a scene exists because something's going to happen at the end. That's why we're living through this. And if you understand that, you won't start in the wrong place, you won't end in the wrong place. If you understand what a scene is doing for your story, you will write a good one instead of what you and I have seen thousands of times, a scene that just kind of is like, let me just tell you what it was like that day at the park. Right? Let me tell you
Yes.
everything that happened, right, at the park that day. And that's not what a scene is supposed to do. So you need a main event in your scene that you write toward, and you need subjective writing.
Yeah, something happens that affects change, especially related to your story, and you're writing it through that lens and you're telling it slant, right? Through the lens that only the narrator has. And an exercise that I often give people to help them understand what subjective writing is to get your journal and look out the window and imagine the very best day of your life and describe what you see through the window, and then do the same thing, but imagine the worst day of your life, right? And when you write, you're going to have different details. So when we're thinking about the striped cat and we're thinking about subjective writing, you're going to have an experience of striped cats. You're either going to love them and you're going to write about how it's scampering and toward you, and some little thing that lets us know you love this cat, or this cat is going to be hideous and dirty or something else because you hate cats. So, understanding what your perspective is so you can write in that subjective way is so important, because you're right. We want to feel like we're getting everything through the eyes of the only person who could tell this specific story.
It's so counterintuitive, isn't it? And I think memoirists are a little afraid of this. They think, oh, because partly because I say to them, no one cares about your life so many times, right? And so they're a little terrified of writing in first person. But the interesting thing is, the more personal this becomes, the more universal it becomes. Haven't you found that?
Oh, 100%. And that's why, when I'm working with someone on their audience, right? So, who is this book for? The more specific you are about your audience, the broader your audience could actually be, because you've spoken to one specific group so well. And I think that happens with a lot of memoirs. I mean, obviously there are niche memoirs that are only for a very small number of people, but there are a lot of times where when are very clear about who that audience is, there is broader appeal. So What My Bones Know by Stephanie Fu is a great example of that. She is very clear about who her audience is, what she is talking about, what her essential question is. That's the language I often use. What you use is premise. And so that's very clear. And then she takes us on the journey that she went through to answer that question, which is, what is CPTSD and how do I heal from it? Right. So she was very clear. And that book was a New York Times bestseller. There are lots and lots of people who have read that book who do not have complex PTSD. and who are just interested in how she was able to tell that story.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I do think if you're incredibly personal, it will resonate with a lot of people because what I tell the people I work with is that there are only so many emotions that a human being can feel, right?
Yes.
And so if you are really sincere on the page and you give me that subjective writing, I may not know what it's like to be a little girl with Korean parents suffering physical abuse, but I
Yes.
definitely know what it's like to feel fear, to feel pain, to feel like nobody cares. And
Yes.
so being really personal does make this universal, and I think it does give it a broader appeal.
Absolutely. And so, one of the things that you talked about in your book, and it was also one of the questions you love to answer, is how to affect your reader with your scene writing. Because that is an art form. And I think that speaks directly to what we're talking about in terms of that appeal is how do you write this in a subjective way that is so effective that I feel your feelings, which is different from the writer feeling a lot when they're writing, because those two things are not always the same. Sometimes they are, but not always.
That is so true. I will often get someone who says, I cried when I wrote this. And I read it and think, oh, well, I'm not crying. And a lot of the problem with memoir writing, one of the difficulties, is that you're recalling these incredibly painful events, sometimes from your childhood, from earlier in your life. So the memory is what makes this difficult for you. But that emotion is not necessarily on the page. And
Yes.
then there's the opposite problem when it can be too much. It can be a little overwhelming. One of the things I really love about Stephanie Foo's book is she really found that balance, right? It's not self pity. It's tough to write a book about physical abuse as a child.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, she did an incredible job of that. So she really did find that balance where it's not overwhelming, it's not depressing. So one of the things I tell people is it's okay to make your readers sad, but you don't want to depress them. And finding that is this really delicate balance because it can be really easy to bleed on the page.
Yes. And I think that leads to the idea of, scenic writing versus a scene, right? So a scene is where something happens that creates transformation, that moves the story forward. And when we're writing in that way, details are important, but we don't need that many, but we need the right ones, right? And I think when we're thinking about trauma in particular, that's a place where people can bleed all over the page by sharing too many of the details of whatever the gruesome thing is. Right. And so there are lots of gruesome things that happen to people that are categorically awful and that readers can connect with. But if you give them all of the details, they're going to be reliving it in a way that is overwhelming and not useful. So how do you find those right details that move the story forward without overwhelming people with a trauma porn info dump?
So I'm glad that you brought up what my bones know because I often go to this memoir as an example of when you're dealing with a lot of difficult things from your childhood, from earlier in your life. And what Stephanie Fu does is she opens up the story. Now, I'm sure you've worked with people whose story was way too open, that their
Yeah.
memoir is about everything they did in their whole life from age 6 to age 50, right? And it was just a mishmash of a bunch of stuff they did. And
Yes.
that's really challenging. But I think the opposite can also be true when it's just abuse scene, abuse scene, abuse scene, abuse scene, abuse.
Yes.
We're at the other end of the continuum. So I often go to what my bones know as an example of opening up a difficult story. And what Stephanie Fu does is she uses a time period in her life. I don't know how she actually got to writing the book, but this is when I work with people, I will suggest that what is the time period? You're writing this book about childhood abuse, but what is Stephanie Fu's first chapter? It's about camp, right? And so write the story of camp. Now, you absolutely have to get your relationship with your mother or the abuse in there in some way, or someone will say, you're just telling me some random story from your childhood. So in Stephanie Fu's book, there's always some relationship with her mother or her father and
Yes.
some physical abuse. But the story is bigger than abuse. It's camp. and then it's going to live with my dad. And it's been a while since I read the book, right? But there's this bigger story, and she opens it up. So it becomes this book about childhood abuse, but it's very easy to read because I'm reading a story about camp, and her mother comes and makes things difficult on her. But I have the camp story, which is very different than what I call an example memoir. It's like example after example after example of you being
Yes.
bullied or you being abused, which is hard to read. So open up those difficult stories and your reader will be with you.
Yeah, and I think the more you can zoom in and zoom out, that's one thing she also does really well. And I would have to say that working at This American Life probably helped. She was really good at directing radio stories. And so I think that helped with her think about how to structure something in a way that's zooming in and zooming out. Because that's another thing she does well is that she talks about her personal experience, but then she will talk about the diasporas that happened in Southeast Asia and the trauma that happened and how that was brought in, or model minorities and that concept, and how children that are from specific Asian communities are passed over and not seen as having trauma because there is this idea as to who they are, all of these, really unhelpful stereotypes that people are kind of implying. So she's able to talk about these different things where she's zooming into her story, zooming out, but also, as you said, she has these frames that are about something other than the abuse. And so she's able to, frame that in a way that gives us a sense of levity and lightness that isn't inauthentic. And I think that's important because whenever writers, especially people who are working with traumatic material, hear the word levity, they think they have to make something nice happen. They do two things. They try to do it on the page and it doesn't work. It falls flat and it feels inauthentic because it is. And also they feel resentful that they're being asked to do something that is unfair. I don't know if you've experienced that with
Oh, absolutely. I just nod at everything you say. This is so much fun for me to talk to you, Lisa, genuinely. So, what I see a lot is people who are writing about their childhood, who had a difficult childhood, writing about their parents, and this need to say, well, my dad wasn't all bad. And it feels somewhat forced, right? Because they're
yes.
feeling guilty. And they're like, well, he wasn't all bad. So, I see that a lot. And it often comes across as insincere. And I think a better solution to that, because they're worried about something genuine, that it is too dark, it is too heavy. My dad wasn't all bad, but a better option is to open up the story. Then keeping it focused on all these things your dad did to you, and including one good one among the five bad ones, a better option is to just open up the story. Write about summer camp and write about all the things you did at summer camp and that time your dad came and embarrassed you. Obviously, I'm taking from Stephanie Fu, and it wasn't her father, it was her mother, but
Right.
it's a better option.
Yeah. So opening up the story is an option. And what do you think about transitional material, the role of transitional material in dealing with issues like this, when we're dealing with a story that's too heavy, or helping to guide people in a specific direction versus just giving them all kinds of examples? Because I feel like, I've read a lot of manuscripts, and there are two ways that they tend to have issues. And one is the idea of having all of these scenes that are really vivid, but I can't see how they're going together, right? So it's the this happened and then this happened and then this happened. But there are other times when there's so much transitional material that I feel like I'm being lectured to, and I lose interest in the book because there's too much exposition, right? So when I think of transitional material, I think of the telling, like the exposition, which is absolutely something that's needed. But how do we balance that? And when you're talking about that transitional material, can you tell us a little more about it so writers can wrap their minds around it?
So for me, it's not a percentage, right? It's not finding the balance. For me, the problem I see is that people use these two components in the wrong way. That's when your reader gets frustrated. So I have seen books that have little tiny scenes and long bits of transition writing, and they work. Like an example is Truth and Beauty by Ann Patchett, a well-respected novelist. I think her memoir is great. She has long chunks of transitions, little tiny scenes, little mini scenes that are half a page long. And then I've seen the opposite of people who have almost no transition writing and it's almost exclusively scene. So both of these can work. When I see the problem happen, it's when people put the wrong information in either their transitions or their scenes. They mix up these two components, which are doing very different things for their book and which have to sound different. Now, the reader doesn't notice that they sound different, so they shouldn't sound
Right.
that dramatically different. Though I have to say, since we're talking about what my bones know, boy, we're giving Stephanie Fu needs to give us a little. We're doing a lot of product placement here, a lot of publicity for Stephanie Fu today. There's a really great example of a really distinct voice between the transitions and the scenes. She uses her older, wiser narrator. It
Yes.
sounds very different. Most books, you don't have such a difference between the transitions and the scenes. So I know the way exactly what you're talking about, that it feels like they're just, I call this describing their life. They go on and they just tell us all this stuff they did and all this stuff about their life, but they're describing and they're telling. They're not putting
Yes.
us there with you. So the problem is not this transition writing, it's actually what is going in this transition writing. So what needs to go in your transition writing are ideas. Ideas, a point that you're making. Transition writing can be beautiful. It can be really rich. You can get these bigger ideas into your book. You know, these bigger themes, these bigger ideas. So I actually love transition writing. The problem is when you start telling me about things that you did or things that happened to you in your transitions. Things that happen belong in your scene. There's something really fascinating. One of the things I tell people, I use this example. I'm like, so last Thursday I went to Target. And so don't you want to say, okay, what happened? Right?
Right.
And so you want me to tell you the story. So what I see in transition writing a lot is people say, well, that summer I went to Europe. And then we went, and it's like, wait, last summer you went to Europe, stop. Anytime something happens in your book, your reader expects to live through it in the form of a scene.
Yes.
So the problem I see is that people start telling me all this stuff that happened to them, all this stuff they did, and they put it in their transitions. And it creates that effect that you're talking about. It feels like someone is just describing their life and you lose interest so quickly. So this is why it's so important to understand what your transition does for your book and what your scenes do. I don't care how long your transitions are, how long your scenes are, as long as you're using them in the right way, you won't drive your reader crazy.
Yes. So, what I want all of you listeners to do is write these things down. And of course, these are simple answers, but there's always more to it. And that's why reading books like the Memoir Engineering System is so important, because that's how you internalize this information, is by reading the book and really thinking about, okay, what was it that Wendy said? How does that work in a book? And then go look for it in published memoirs, but also look for it in your own writing and look for it in your peers' writing. So, have critique partners that you are working with where you can read some of their work, even if you decide that you don't want to have a formal feedback session, right? But that you are getting a chance to read through things and hear what works and what doesn't work. And then ask yourself the question, why? Why does this work? Why doesn't this work for me? And how is this showing up in my own writing?
Great. Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better, Lisa. Absolutely. Yes. I do try and make the process faster. I really do believe in concepts that I had to write by trial and error. So my enemy is writing by trial and error. And the way to avoid doing that is understanding how story works, understanding what a scene is doing for your book, understanding how to write to the main event, understanding what kind of transition you actually need, just speed up this process by so many years. So I really do believe in concepts.
Yes. And I love that you are about speeding up the process, because I do think, there are some stories that take a long time to tell, because it takes a long time for the person to have the insights to be able to write the story. So that can certainly happen in the same way that it took you 15 years to write the book, even though you understood the ideas once you did all the work, right? That happened. But I think if you understand the streamlined process, if it can go faster, it will go faster. And 9 times out of 10, it can go faster. And the thing you don't want to do is spend your entire life on one book and feel like you still don't have it done?
Speaking to that, I find that it's less about the insights. Now, it does take some time to get to the insights. I think that's almost more of an age thing or the number of years since the events have happened. So you need to be ready to actually write this book. But the problems I see, because I've had people who've been working on their books for 20, even 25 years, and they come to me, they're struggling less with what they want to say and how to actually say it. So the problem is they come up with more and more pages. Now they have 2,000 pages, and now they have a new problem. They don't know what's good and what isn't good, and they don't know what
Right.
to cut down. So I find a bigger problem is people just not knowing what's good, not knowing what makes a memoir good.
Yeah, and, one of the differences between fiction writing and memoir writing is that most memoirs come to the process with something powerful that has happened to them, a personal story they wanna tell, and not a lot of writing experience. Whereas fiction writers are like, "Okay, I'm gonna be a writer, so I'm gonna learn that storytelling process." It's just a different mindset, I find.
That's a really interesting point. Yes, I think a lot of people reach a certain point in their life and they want to chronicle their life. And so
Yeah.
you do have a lot of non-writers with this noble goal and they don't quite realize what they're in for, right? I sometimes say it's a little bit like not knowing how to play the flute and expecting to put it up to your mouth and play a Beethoven symphony. It's you need to learn how to play a flute. You need to learn how to write. You need to learn what makes for a good story.
Yes, and what I often tell people to give themselves a little grace is that if I were to take the analogy, I would say it's like hearing the flute and knowing what a flute sounds like, but never having picked one up and then suddenly expecting yourself to be able to emulate that same sound. Because, so many people have been highly productive, highly successful in their lives. They're smart, they're dedicated, they want to do the work, and they've been writing sentences and speaking the language their whole life and not recognizing that there is a difference between writing beautiful emails or communicating through language in other ways and telling a story, that those are two totally different things. You have to learn the mechanics and the schematics of how stories work so that you can do that well.
Absolutely. Even writing a blog. Writing a blog is not the same as writing a memoir. Yeah, there is this attitude. I tell people that it's unlike any other art form, right? There's this idea that, oh, well, I've been writing, I've been speaking sentences my whole life, I've been writing letters. Well, how hard could it possibly be to write a book?
Right.
I compare it to people going to a ballet class for the first time. The teacher doesn't say, just jump around the room, you'll figure it out eventually. You are taught skills, and the same is true
Yes.
with writing.
Well, if people want to connect with you, they want to learn more about the memoir engineering system, and most importantly, read it so that they can really internalize these concepts. What are the best ways for people to connect with you?
So I coach people at my company is called Memoir Writing for Geniuses. You can find me at geniusmemoirwriting.com. You can also find me at freememoirclass.com. So sign up for a free 7-part memoir class. Google my book is probably the easiest way to find it, the Memoir Engineering System. And I also have a YouTube channel, and I try and put out a new video once a week. And the YouTube channel is also called Memoir Writing for Geniuses. It's tongue in cheek, by the way. Some people think that it's serious. I created this name a long time ago when the For Dummies books were all the rage, and I thought it was a joke. So Memoir Writing for Geniuses is really tongue in cheek.
Well, it's also memorable. So kudos to you for finding something that works and plays on the Dummies series, which I don't know, can be surprisingly good. I was shocked by that. My dad, he swears by them. So I'm like, all right, dad.
Yeah, they're not bad. They're very simple, easy to understand. Absolutely.
Well, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you on the show and to talk with you about this. It's so exciting to talk with someone who speaks the language and wants to talk about this with the same level of enthusiasm as I bring to it. I'm going to give you the last word, but before I do, I'm just going to say thank you so much for being here today. So, what would you like to say to wrap up?
I would say thank you so much for having me. Write your memoir, but keep in mind that it's not the story of your life. You want your book to read like a novel.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Wendy and most importantly, buy a copy of the Memoir Engineering System, please see the show notes for this episode. But before you go, I would love it if you would text the show if you're on Apple Podcast or Spotify, or leave a comment on YouTube with the answer to the following question. What is the biggest struggle you're facing right now when working on your memoir? I would love to hear your answer. Plus, you never know if that could show up in one of my future episodes. And speaking of your comments, I would love to give a shout out to Stephanie Shaffron, Wendy Kennar, and Shannon's channel for your thoughtful comments on YouTube. Thank you so much for reaching out. It was lovely to hear from you. And every time you do so, you help with the YouTube algorithm. And listeners, if you haven't reached out to the show, I would love to hear from you too. I couldn't do this podcast without your support. If you love this episode, here are 3 simple ways that you can keep this show thriving. 1, subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. 2, leave a 5-star review so others can find the show. 3, join my engaged dynamic community by signing up for the Writing Your Resilience newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Ditch Your Inner Critic, 5 tools to transform self-doubt into self-support. Until next time, remember that your story matters. As you write and connect with the truest, most authentic version, you become not just the writer, but the person you're meant to be. And that, my friends, is the real freedom writing can offer.